Welcome back to another episode of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm your host, Susie Selleck. Today we are in Farmersville, Ohio, and I'm joined by Sherry Wallace. Sherry, thank you for being here.
Happy to be here.
And I'm also joined by Daryl Weller. Daryl, thank you for having us.
Very happy to. Thank you.
Right out of the gate, Farmersville, Ohio is where we are. How did Farmersville get its name?
Farmersville was founded back in the early 1800s, and the primary occupation was farming. Mm-hmm. So Oliver Dalrymple founded the community and plotted out the village of Farmersville. And when he did that, he gave it the name of Farmersville in honor of his friends and all of the constituents and the people that were here in the town.
Daryl, can you talk to us a little bit about the Schwartzel Brothers?
The ground around Farmersville was actually founded. The original settlers here were a family by the name of Swartsel. Primarily, there was a Matthias, and an Abraham Swartzel. And they owned the majority of the ground to the west of where the village is currently located. And it was plotted off, and their entire family took over almost everything, had almost all the land from the village of Farmersville to Preble County, which is our adjoining county to the west.
Yes. Now, there was another brother that we talked about earlier, and I believe his name was Winter Zero Swartsel. Can you elaborate a little bit? He seemed to have had a very eccentric personality from the way you described him. I'd love for you to talk about that brother as well and, his contributions.
Winter Zero Swartsel was actually one of the grandchildren of the original founding Schwartzel Brothers. Okay, Winter Zero had an eccentric personality, and he had actually spent most of his young adult life traveling through Asia on a bicycle. And when he actually came back to the United States, he bought some land from one of his uncles and settled west of town in an area that is currently our village and township park. And his home there was he was an early hoarder, okay? It was very filled up with a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but he had this eccentricity that he would go out and drive metal fence posts into the ground over this whole 26 acres, and then he would hang bottles on these posts of different colors and different shapes and different sizes, and it came with the name of the bottle farm. That was the biggest draw in the west part of Montgomery County, and we actually had signs at one time at the city limits with arrows pointing to where the bottle farm is. And he passed away in 1952. He was married at the time, and his wife wanted the property, but he had already donated it to the Historical Society of Ohio. The Historical Society of Ohio didn't want the property because they didn't want to have to maintain it. So it was handed down to the county, Montgomery County, Ohio. And Montgomery County says, we don't want it. So it was passed down to the township, which is Jackson Township. And Jackson Township says, we don't want it. So it was given to the village of Farmersville to maintain. Well, back in about 1958, his house and all the building, there was an auction sold off. A lot of his possessions were sold. But what was left, they actually tore down the house and buried it out there on the park.
Great story. And I know, Sherry, that you have even more details about the bottle farm. I would love for you to elaborate.
I do. Well, as Daryl said, Winter was quite eccentric. You never saw much of him. He had a caretaker by the name of Bill Tyler. And Bill came into town every day with his shopping bag and get whatever they needed for the day. And then they would come back out there to the property, and then they would run their lives just as eccentric as it sounds. And not only did he put the bottles on fence posts, he had buggies and bed frames and all kinds of metal sculpture that he designed. He was a very good sculptor of metal. And he also was really into Egyptian hieroglyphics. And he painted these on the side of his barn, which, by the way, he sawed the main beam down the center of the barn so it would sway. And inside that barn, he kept everything imaginable. And he brought them out. He would hang them in trees. You saw saw blades, sort of like wind chimes made out of spoons and forks and all kinds of farm implements. And then he also collected bells. He had 88 bells, one for every county in Ohio. And the largest of these bells was called Mother Montgomery. He named everything. And Mother Montgomery was the main bell that he cherished. And in these bells, they really didn't clang. I don't know if they couldn't clang or if they just were so heavy they couldn't clang. But he did have bells on all of his sheep, which were his lawnmowers. And the sheep had these little bells. They weren't pretty bells either. But when the sheep would walk, you could hear the clank clang of the bells. My family lived west of town, and I remember as a child, whenever the wind would blow strong from the west, we could hear the eerie sounds that came from the bottle farm. And all the bells on the sheep, we could hear that. We could hear music. He played music all the time, and he had speakers up in the trees. And this he had surrounding his area property there were red cedar trees, and they were so aromatic and beautiful, but they also whistled when the wind blew. The rushing through the cedar trees made a sound. So it was just really, really crazy, the sounds that you could hear coming from them with his music. And on the back of his little car, he had let the rest of the world roll by, and he would play all the time music. And sometimes he would even put it on his car, run through town with it. The Old Rugged Cross was one of his favorite, and it would play continuously out at the park.
I'm not mad about that. I would have loved to have been around to hear that. That's awesome.
Yeah. He really. I'm a kindred spirit because I feel every time I go out there, I love to stand where the house used to be, which is now pretty much a shelter, picnic shelter. But I love to go out there and think about what he thought about. How in the world did he become so eccentric? And, it was nothing for him to collect every kind of bottle imaginable. And people were invited to bring bottles out to the train depot. And they had a place for people to come dump their bottles. And then Winter would go and pick them up and take them out to the farm and decorate his bottle trees.
This is the same guy who rode his bike through Asia. It was Asia, right?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, and so I'm with you. The thoughts that must have gone through his head to do the things that he did, right? And that obviously being one of the towns, if not the most highly attractive place to visit. Yeah?
Yes, really. He. Do you remember when milk used to come in glass bottles? Yeah. And on the tops of those bottles were shiny little caps that open when you used to open the bottles. He saved all of those shiny little caps and hung those from the bottle tree farm. So that when the wind blew, it would make them glitter and shine. And so that was an added piece to all of his other things. And on the inside of the house, it was just as crazy. Anything that ever went in the house or on the property never came out or left the property. Yeah, it was crazy.
Sherry, I I love this story. I love that you know your history about the town, and especially the detail that you have with the bottle farm. And I think really, Daryl, it would lead me back to, you being the president of the mayor, of course, of this town, and the president of the Historical Society. I probably should have done you justice in the intro to say that, but you do care very much about this town and its rich, beautiful history and the preservation of it, and how it moves forward with the younger generation. If you can just take a minute to talk about that would be great.
Well, with the Swartsel settling the majority of the ground to the west of town, obviously there had to be others as the families grew. Okay, and what's happened is there are 4 houses here in town that were built by Schwartzel families. Okay, and I can identify a few of them, but probably not all of them. But so they began to build the community. And obviously with the draw and the eccentricity of Winter Zero, we had a lot of tourism that would come from Dayton. And it got to the point where we actually had signs at our city limits that said the bottle farm, and it would have an arrow pointing which way to go, so you would know where to go to the bottle farm. This was a private farm, but yet the village took advantage of it for the tourism and the growth. So it brought people out here, and once the people began to come out here and see that the village was a nice, quiet little town, okay, it's probably one of the primary reasons that Farmersville grew to the size that it is. Even though it's very small, it was probably one of the potential reasons why the village actually grew.
Daryl, talk to us a little bit about this structure that we are standing in right now that the Historical Society operates out of.
This building here, when I grew up in town, was a house, and we never even knew that the log house was here. And it was here for years. It had been added on to in almost every direction. And there was a gentleman that owned this by the name of Bickle, Forrest Bickle. And when Forrest got older, and he began to slow down, although he was still delivering fuel oil in his son's truck until he was 94 years old. Oh. Yes, and when he went in, got ready to retire and go into a nursing home, he donated this property to the village. And inherently, the people here in town says, well, we have to do something. So we formed a historical society. This was back in 1980, and they tore down the added-on structure. They restored this home, and you can see from the outside where a couple of the logs have been replaced. And several years ago, I had an advisor on restoration come out, and we were looking at rechinking the logs, and he says we don't need to rechink. He says if we need to redo anything, he says we need to take some out because the chinking was too beyond the front of the logs, and it was forcing the water to come in between the logs. So we went along with a grinder and ground angles on the top of all the chinking so the water would run off rather than run in. But he told us, he asked us, he says, why do you know why these logs are sawn flat on the inside and the outside? And the 3 people that were here with me said, no, none of us knew why they would do that. He says that was because this house was built in 1836, and he says at that point in time there were ordinances requiring you to put siding on a house that any building that you built in Farmersville.
Love that. Good story. Which you have some interesting information too, and I love this about towns. Can you talk about the Masonic Lodge and the churches as well, Sherry?
Yes, the Masonic Temple that is right down the street here started out being a school, and it was a school for all 12 grades, and there were like maybe 10 in each class. And the churches kept coming, and we have several in town now, and that church itself brought more people together for any kind of social event. It became, if you weren't a Boy Scout or a Girl Scout or belonged to a youth group at a church, that was your whole social life in this village. And our churches have always supported one another, come together once a year for a combined church service, which combined is a good word because it binds all of us together, and everyone looks forward to that one service that we can all be together, and we talk about it until the next year.
So both of you have been a delight to interview today. I love your passion for the town. I love your knowledge for the town, both of you. And so Sherry, Daryl, thank you so much for having us here today and being able to share your town with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching another episode of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm your host, Susie Selleck, and today we were in Farmersville, Ohio. Sherry, Daryl, thank you both once again. And remember, travel slowly and stop often. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.